right, so hello everyone. I'm really happy to be here, by the way. First time in St. Petersburg, first time in Russia, so I'm really excited. Something about me, so I'm Valentina. I'm originally Italian, but I live and work in the Netherlands for Accenture Interactive Amsterdam. I don't know how many of you know Accenture. It's quite internationally spread, but specifically in Amsterdam, what we do is we're consulting, so we help our clients to drive innovation, to find the best way, human-centric way, to drive innovation, to solve their challenges. Let's say in general, as an expertise, we're really focused on digital products, right? The digital transformation, so apps, portals. But this case study that I'm going to show to you today is far different from that. Also to showcase how design, user research can be applied in different contexts where technology can actually bring a value at times, but not necessarily. I don't know how many of you heard about Plan International, but for the ones who never did, Plan International is an NGO that is spread in 75 countries worldwide. Basically, they focus on advancing children's rights, but also women, young girls' rights towards gender equality. So pretty cool client to work for, and also quite an exception, right, for also a company like Accenture that mainly drives commercial projects to also work on a pro bono initiative for them. So what am I going to talk about today? So my story, I would like to tell you, first of all, the challenge. So what is it that we actually tried to solve for them? Solve, I think, is a big term because we had just 2 months' time. But to help them, let's say, to address, to focus, for them to take the first steps towards the right direction. Secondly, I'm going to guide you through the design and research phase because I went to Uganda myself twice last summer, actually a few months back. Still pretty fresh in my mind. So I'm going to tell you a little bit what kind of tools I used and why, to hopefully also give some sort of inspiration whenever and if you're going to find yourself scoping some user research for challenges in vulnerable communities for social innovation purposes. You never know. Also, how basically this research work fed into a design sprint. Actually, a previous talk mentioned design sprint, so great to have this connection as well. They saved some of my job for my speech. And also the concept, so what is it that we sort of figured out, although pretty high level, but what was the outcome of the design sprint? And ultimately, I'm going to try to drive some conclusion on a personal level when applying service design methodologies and user research in vulnerable communities for this project, but also connected to some previous projects that I conducted in similar topics. So let's start. The challenge. So the challenge was the following. I was at my desk in Amsterdam, imagine, and this brief came up. How can we support marginalized girls aged 14 to 24 in rural Uganda so that they can secure employment or entrepreneurship while positively impacting the environment? Whoa, pretty massive statement, ambitious, a lot of problems entwined into it. But if you try to simplify a little bit, so basically, Plan International really aimed at triggering employment opportunities for young girls, who basically are the target user that are trying to empower within society, but also in a way that could do something good for the environment. So really, let's say, connected to also the social development goals. Trying again to sort of break down this challenge, 3 are the main points that we were trying to address. So first of all, gender inequality. Uganda is a pretty patriarchal country, so women don't get necessarily access to decision-making tables, and this is a reality the more you go far from Kampala, the capital. In the rural areas, it's way more common, unfortunately. Youth unemployment, so in Africa it's pretty widespread, but Uganda has pretty high rates in comparison to other countries. So really Plan International wanted to tackle this. And also climate change. Of course, it is not new to your ears, but Uganda, specifically, is a pretty green country that lives out of agriculture. But over time, they've been applying pretty non-sustainable techniques when it comes to agriculture, like chemical pesticides, deforestation, and now they start seeing the consequences of such behaviors. So Plan International was like, okay, how can we support triggering new behavioral change, new sustainable practices? But we started broad, and I'll show you our process. So again, I was in Amsterdam, received this brief, really excited about working in such topics that, again, are not necessarily common to me to work for. And I basically decided to plan my design research on field. That was 2 weeks' time, so I didn't have a lot of time, unfortunately. I had to be quite effective and pragmatic and to try to find all the data that I needed in a short time. But I decided to go for a generative research approach. Have you ever heard about generative research approach? Please raise your hand if you did. Okay, a few hands, not so many, good, because I hope to tell you something new today. So generative research is something very simple. So basically, it aims not only to collect data via interviews or more standard qualitative research methods, but also by basically being collaborative with your users and giving to them some other mean, aside from words, to express themselves and to basically communicate and for you to gather research data. So sketching activities or like workshop activities or anything, role play, something that could sort of bridge the gap whenever language is a barrier. And that was my case. Because you will see later on in the presentation, but I always had a translator next to me to bridge the gap between myself and the user. So I really needed, on my hand, to find a way to make this distance as minimum as possible. And this approach helped very much. So if I had to sort of let's say, differentiate the tools, divide them in 2 buckets that I applied on field. I went for a co-creation approach on one end, and also more standard qualitative research techniques on the other. So as soon as I arrived, I tried to really book some time with the local stakeholders. So Plan International representatives at different roles, so across like competencies, but mainly people that were really in contact with the end user. So again, young women between 14 and 24. I gathered them in a room, like around 15 people, to really discuss and understand from them how success should have looked like, from their own knowledge, from their own expertise, since they ran multiple projects for Plan International concerning not only children, but young women. So what is it that they learned in the past? What worked, what didn't? Any lack, any red flag that I needed to know from Plan International perspective, but also what was the ambition from Plan International to really leverage for a project like this. And I had a similar session with the actual end users. So 15 young women gathered in a room, also a tiny little baby. I don't know if you can see it, wrapped in a blanket. It was really nice. And with them, actually, the session was a little bit different, because now here what I wanted to know is their dreams, their wishes, their needs as young women in the community in rural Uganda. Was even employment something that they were thinking about, or was not? I don't know. What did they know about climate change? Just all these big questions were addressed to try to really understand their values, what was mattering to them, for me to really understand the context. Because of course I didn't know. There was a huge cultural gap there that I needed to sort of fill in somehow. Just to give you an example on how I sort of embrace these sessions, I'm going to show you a couple of exercises. Super basic. You'll see, like, it can be absolutely, they can be easily adapted also to other contexts, potentially in your practice, whenever you will find yourself, not necessarily in Uganda, anywhere else in the world when culture can be a little bit different. This is a very interesting one. Super simple, but that makes it interesting also to me. It's called the Big Four. Basically, you get like an A4 paper, you divide it in 4 parts, and you just hand it over to participants. And you ask, like, what are the big 4, like, most important things in their life? What is it that they really value? And that was really interesting because we used it as an energizer, so I did it as well, together with the team who were presenting. And it was really fascinating how different kind of insights were coming up. And they were already data that I could feed into my research process from the start, because you really understand what is it that really matter to my user, my end users, that I needed to serve when coming to addressing a draft solution for them. And also it was super interesting because very different insights that potentially would have come up in Amsterdam or in Italy or in Russia came up, like something like, I don't know, religion or family or roads or mobile phones or education. So something that I really needed to know. Second exercise was mainly revolving around this unemployment kind of focus. So really triggering to them to think, okay, so what are the skills that you know now, that you feel comfortable? It can be anything, like a language, you can paint, or what is it that you can do? Do you have any activity that you're actually conducting now? So a little bit of a self-reflection into your present self. And also a second part mainly revolving around the future. So where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? And that could be anything, you know, it could be like a mother of 2 children, it could be like actually advancing in my education, it's pretty open. After this part of co-creation actually entwined, it was happening in parallel. I conducted also more than 15 interviews. I couldn't do more in 2 weeks. That was the maximum I could achieve. Of course, with end users on one end, but also with Plan International representatives at different levels, both in Kampala, but also in the rural areas, so in Kamuli, which is a tiny town 3 hours away from Kampala. And then for the interviews, combined to the interviewing process, I was actually using card sorting. This helped very much when interviewing the Plan International stuff, but most importantly, it really helped when interviewing the end users, where the actual language barrier was there. Because very easily was helping me to understand, okay, to do some very quick and simple prioritization exercises, or to really put in order the topics that they had knowledge about, or maybe things that were new to them. So that worked really well. What is it in these cards? Basically, before going to Uganda myself, I, of course, had to document myself around green skills, green jobs. I didn't know much about that. So I needed to read literature, what was out, and I tried to summarize my findings into this quick and easy card. So agriculture, livestock, ecotourism, renewable energy, anything. And that really, really worked to have this sort of tangible artifact to play along with the users and to really facilitate conversation. And last but not least, shadowing. So I don't know how many of you ever sort of conducted a shadowing session. Please raise your hand. Not so many. OK, right. So shadowing basically is a technique, very basic. Like it actually means like being the shadow of someone, like sort of following, right? Not really following. I mean, I was not following them too closely, but like sort of observing, right, your end users in context. So that I was basically observing like their surroundings, so where they were living, meeting their children, seeing how many members were composing their household. So all the things that you don't really get when you interview one-on-one in a different environment that is not the actual original environment of your users. So this was, I think, the most overwhelming day of my 2 weeks, because imagine I visited the home of 3 young women in one day. So I was spending around 2 hours per household doing this observation session. And it was really hot. I didn't have absolutely enough water, so I was a little bit dizzy at times. And of course, although I conducted some projects in Africa in similar context, you never get yourself prepared to see some kinds of scenarios. So it was also personally, like as a human being, quite overwhelming. But on a research perspective, it was really rewarding because I could really understand way deeper their context. So I came back to Amsterdam, and of course I wrote like a pretty detailed report about each single activity that I conducted, what was the response, like data, cross-checking, looking for partners. But at the end, if I had to summarize, let's say, the finding and the direction that we got after these 2 weeks, is this one. So starting from broad green skills, green jobs topic, that could be livestock, ecotourism, renewable energy, deforestation, agriculture, we came to this conclusion. So the most sensible area for Plan International to address as a priority for the community by listening to users was agriculture, but most importantly, organic agriculture. So being facilitators in this shift from traditional agriculture means that in Uganda, unfortunately, mean applying pesticides and non-sustainable behaviors to organic agriculture, so sustainable practices. Why that? So on one hand, this was very much in line with Plan International goals. So in order for them to sort of build a portfolio really revolving around green economy concepts. But most importantly, on the user side of the picture, what came out from the interviews is that agriculture was really a passion for a lot of young women that we interviewed. Maybe they didn't have the means or the seedlings or the actual good equipment to conduct it professionally, to get a good produce out of it, but they were conducting it as a backyard gardening, as a activity, like doing aside from other types of work, and also was embedded in the gender norms and in the culture of the place. So it would have meant improving their situation, but of course leveraging household the dynamics and cultural aspects that couldn't have been forgotten or ignored. So then we went back after a couple of weeks to Uganda, so it was quite a dynamic summer, flying in and out. So I came back with a colleague of mine, Lisa, and we ran a design sprint. We ran the design sprint in Kampala with different representatives from Kamuli, Kampala itself. And the interesting aspect is that we provided previously a training to the Plan International members. So now they had the knowledge, how you run a design sprint, what is it, the methodology involved, and they were the team. They were running it. We were only sort of supporting when needed, but all the ideas that came out from them. And here, especially in the prototyping day, so day 4, I don't know how many of you are familiar with design sprints, but just a short recap. So it's a 5-day innovation loop. You start on a Monday with a challenge that you want to solve. On a Tuesday, you come up with a lot of ideas. Day 3, you pick one. Day 4, this one, you prototype. And day 5, you run a user test with minimum 5 users. So again, coming from, Accenture Interactive, apps, websites, portals, really AI, complex tech stuff, we actually realized that technology was not necessarily needed, or at least not at this stage. So if in a normal design sprint in Amsterdam, we would have involved the product designers, high-level complex flow in one day, this time was just not needed. So I think you just need also to recognize when technology should come to play and when maybe it should come to play at a later stage. So we went quite lo-fi here, pretty analog. You can see cardboard, grass from the garden of the Office of Plan International, different kinds of materials to really showcase this concept that I'm going to tell you a little bit more about. It was like that. So there were I think around 8 people working on it. So they took ownership of a different part. So they, Peter on the left, you can see is more like a high-level plan of how a village would have changed based on this concept, and then more details on a single household. So how a household would have been impacted. And then we invited, of course, 5 users, so 5 young women from Kamuli. So the client was amazing because they really facilitated, a van, 3 hours to really let these young women come join us, see the prototype, give feedback that was fundamental for us. And good news is we got a very strong validation, of course an initial one, right? Only 5 users, and the concept was absolutely high level, you will see. But it was very good to address and to direct the client towards the right direction, and at least to filter down the number of options. So what is it that we came up with? So again, pretty broad, high level, still needed, of course, some work. It's not that we can change the world in a day, and surely we don't have a magic wand. But basically, on day 2, which is the ideation day, we ran the lighting demos. Again, reference to the previous talk. So we really needed some inspiration, some experts coming to talk to us, to tell us what is it that they were doing around agriculture and sustainable agriculture. And we had this doctor, fantastic woman from the Kampala Urban Farming Institute, that she told us about all the techniques that they run successfully around urban farming. So urban farming really revolves around the idea of maximizing space, right? It's not that you can necessarily cultivate potatoes in extensive pieces of land like the traditional way, but you need to find ways to use pipes or pots or very small pieces of land to still have a high quality produce. They can still sell to the market at a good price. So the participants really got very excited because they started to draw some connections between this urban farming concept and the reality in the rural areas. Because women don't own land. So women would have never had the chance necessarily to really cultivate extensively. But what they do now, and that we discovered in the research, is that they do backyard gardening. So something pretty much alike. So we said, why not applying urban farming techniques, maybe reviewing which technique would work best, which kind of crop would work best in the rural environment, since there is this strong pattern actually coming up in terms of space. And of course, providing a very strong training program for them. So trainers, experts, to really teach them how, for example, to create sustainable pesticides that are not bad for the environment, or maybe to really, for them to understand from the seedling to the actual end produce, what are the steps, what are the metrics, the rules in the market in order, for them to accept these products and to sell them at a good price. And then by rolling this out, they could get an extra income in a steady manner to become more financially independent and to really live out from agriculture. So yeah, this cycle basically of activities happened just a few months ago, was just last summer. And of course, there's a long list, right, of things to check, to explore further in the local reality. I would say 3 are the priorities at this moment to advance. First of all, establish local partnerships. So the Urban Farming Institute is one, right? Because they have the knowledge, they have the trainers, they know how to select this equipment, which one to really roll out. But also set up the supply chain. It's not enough to train young women if you don't have a distribution system, for instance, right? Who is going to pick up this produce? How can they really be injected into the larger picture in Uganda? And also market scan. What are the crops that there's really demand for, right? What are the crops that really make sense to really inject and to really promote within this training program? And also, most importantly, once the above will be drafted, and we're actually working on it, conduct a pilot testing. So starting from 100, 200 young women, 6 months' time, see what happens, monitor, and iterate, of course. Iteration loop, feedback loop, to make it stronger. So this is all I wanted to share on the project itself. Now just a couple of slides on some more high-level, let's say, learnings for myself when really applying service design methodologies or user research, as you saw, in such vulnerable, very different context. So let's start with the don'ts. Don't lecture. It might seem very basic, right? But we're professionals, we know what we're doing, like we're experts in our reality. But remember that when you find yourself actually running a project in such a different environment, locals are experts of their own reality, and you should respect that. So initiate a conversation, conduct your job, but always respecting, right, that difference and that knowledge that you might miss. Also, don't overcomplicate it. Like if you're not necessarily an expert, or if you never found yourself before running a workshop or a research in these kind of different environments, well, keep it simple for yourself. Start from the tools that you feel familiar using, and then go step by step from there. And also don't set unrealistic expectations, right? Especially when working with children or teenagers, they might see you as a savior, but you're not. So be transparent about the kind of contribution that you're asked to give. What are your limitations, in regards to the bigger picture, right? You might not be necessarily the decision maker pushing this forward. So be honest always. And don't underestimate the local support. So this is something that personally I found a benefit in multiple times when working in Africa, in this kind of context. Working side by side with locals always made my work come across as more legit at the eyes of the locals, right? Having a trusted organization introducing you to them, or maybe pairing up in the interviews process can really help to make your work, your reason to be there, more trustworthy. And the do's. So very basic again, but be human first, right? So maybe you're gonna go there, run your project because you're good at your job, because you're a good professional. But first of all, try to let yourself be seen as a human being, right? That will really, that is gonna help you very much in any micro, tiny interaction that you're gonna have and feel at home way more faster. And also consider artifacts to trigger conversations. So as you saw previously in the presentation, even some cards, some sort of sketching exercise, it can be as basic as that, but it can really help to direct the conversation and to make these interactions and these frictions just disappear. And also accept to let go. You're not going to be at your office in control of the space, of the supplies, or just accept that it's different. Just go with the flow. Really try to learn to let it go and to still get something meaningful out of it. And last but not the least, leave something behind. It can be, again, picture, it can be like a certificate of completion or a thank you, for attending the session. But just try to recognize as much as possible the time that these people are really dedicating to you in research and in these workshops. I also wrote an article about that. I try to write about my practice. So feel free to check it out for more details or really to understand a little bit better about what I do, what kind of projects we face. And thank you very much. Spasiba for your time and attention.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you so much, and I can say you're doing really great things. Just because I knew people that are creating the IT products for sports betting mostly and for casinos, and the market mostly placed in Africa. And in my humble opinion, that's not fair, just earning money on these people. So yeah, and they didn't even were there. So okay, now it's time for questions. I hope you have, yeah, great.
Hey Valentina, thanks a lot. It was actually very interesting. I actually have two questions for you.
Please go ahead.
So the first one is how easy it is to implement such a project in such countries like in Uganda. I mean, do you ever face any sort of like excessive bureaucracy or lack of governmental support? And the second thing is about the scalability. I mean, when the project is done, is implemented, like what is the potential, the opportunity for future growth? As far as I understand, it was like done in one particular place.
Yes.
But is it like any opportunity to expand to other places, and like what is the future for such projects in general? Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your questions. Really good, both of them. So starting from the first one, yeah, it is. It is a challenge. Funding is one of them. Because again, actually, we helped Plan International also to apply to funding internally, like they have an innovation hub. This is always a little bit tricky, because from the government side as well, there's the tendency not necessarily to give a priority to such initiatives, right? Also around climate change, it might not be really at the top in the agendas of most of the governments, or at least not as high as it should be, in my opinion. So absolutely, yes. Also in the past, when working in Namibia for another project, I had as well unemployment as one of these weak problems that we try to tackle. There's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of funding issues, and actually lasted 4 years, that one. So here in this one, we're still, as you could see from the very high level concept, very much work in progress, right? So we finalized this very much hands-on, on-site phase just in the summer. So now in the process to figure out next steps. But yeah, there are some difficulties involved, absolutely, can be honest about that. Which is a pity. Second question, it was around scalability. So actually it was one of the criteria of Plan International to pick Uganda as an initial, because Uganda, among the Plan International offices and headquarters, actually won a competition, an internal competition, to be the country that we would have worked for. And that had the idea to be the first location, basically to address, trying to get a initiative that could roll on successfully on site, to really understand then how Plan International could have been applying the same concept, but for instance in Vietnam or in different areas that still have the same fundamental issues, but potentially in an adapted version for that culture, that location, maximizes the resources. So it's absolutely in our agenda and in the plan and how we envision this initiative.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the amazing talk, and very interesting, actually, specifics as well. So you mentioned that in Uganda, it's purely male-dominated, let's say, strategic or high-level decisions. How was it perceived that you and your colleague, Lisa, you mentioned, were female? Did it play for or against you?
No, I mean, in my personal experience, actually, the client was amazing, and I think there is a reason why Plan International is trying to advance children's rights and human, and girls and women rights. So actually, in the office, there was a majority, like a lot of women running also leadership positions. So I think they are a quite unique and worth mentioning reality in the country. And I think also on a research approach, from a research angle, being myself, like a woman on field, really tackling these sort of topics with other women, right? And really asking them, okay, so how do you perceive this? What do you think? I think it really reduced the barrier and made it easier and more like a sort of conversation, and to really increase the empathy as well along the process. So I saw it as benefit. Thanks for your question.
More questions? No? No one? Just, I will translate this for
Totally,
you.
yeah, please,
sure.
yeah.
Hello, thanks a lot for your speech,
Talk.
for your talk. В общем,
Thanks to you
Вопрос,
for making the effort. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
вопрос заключается в том, что вы рассказываете о положительном опыте взаимодействия исключительно, а были ли какие-то ситуации, которые, ну, как бы были деструктивны в данном разрезе? То есть, ну вот как уже говорили про даже небольшую, а сильную доминацию со стороны мужчин над женщинами в той культуре, а с чем еще вы могли столкнуться вот во время работы и сталкивались ли? Ну, о каком-нибудь, в общем, плохом опыте.
Okay, I think you understand the phrase destructive, right? So you've been talking about the positive experience during your work, but can you please tell about some negative aspects you faced during your design sprints, etc. For example, one more about the man's pressure, like, you know. So.
Yeah. So, well, when thinking about my previous experiences, well, I think I've been quite lucky so far because I don't recall any like bad memory in this kind of context, but something that is not necessarily negative, but that could be a challenge when you are facilitating a workshop or sort of leading this kind of process in such environments where the cultural gap can be quite big, is, for instance, communication barrier. There is not necessarily speaking another language, but also in terms of behavior. Like, for example, in Uganda, the way to say yes is like this. And at the beginning, I thought, oh, I did something wrong here. Maybe, you know, I don't know, offended someone, or like, what does this mean? So also the behavioral language, like gestures, like always try to, if you can, document yourself on what might be perceived as not offensive, but maybe not necessarily positively perceived by another person. Like, always try to be mindful about, you know, like something that I faced also, another challenge, not negative, but a challenge for me was that some of these young girls were very shy. So I really wanted to try to make them feel comfortable as much as possible. So maybe we had to go, like, I don't know, in a quiet environment instead of being outside together with, you know, their household members going in and out. Maybe finding like a nice, quiet space for only me and my interviewee being like together. Like, try to be mindful about the best way to make your the people you're trying to interview or having, you know, workshop with comfortable as much as possible. So try to really understand from locals what could help you. Try to really be curious, you know, and to ask, really.
Thanks a lot.
No worries. Thank you for the question.
So yeah, thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.